The chapters of the draft Subbasin Joint GSP. We'll start with introductions of the representatives to the Coordination Committee, and we'll start down here and work across.
Hi, I'm Keith Helmuth. I'm with the City of Madera GSA.
I'm Derek Robinson, City of Madera City Council.
Tina Nolan, Madera Irrigation District, GSA.
Dave LaQuashi, Madera Irrigation District.
Phil Jansen, Board Member, Madera Water District.
Eric Abrahamson, Madera Water District.
Brett Frazier, Madera County Board of Supervisors. Greg Young, Technical Consultant for the Madera County GSA.
All right, now I will turn it over to our facilitator for today, Malka Kopel.
Yes. Hi, I'm Malka Kopel from Cal State Sacramento, and I'd like the rest of the staff to introduce themselves. Go ahead.
Brian Thorson with Davis Engineering, Technical Consultant for the GSP.
Stephanie and Agneson, Madera County.
Pete Leffler, Technical Consultant for the GSP.
I'm Julia Van Horn. I'm also part of the facilitation team with Sacramento State University.
Andrea Sandoval, I'm taking notes.
Thank you. And if anybody needs Spanish translation, I'd like to encourage you to seek out Reina in the back there. Trying to find a comfortable way to use this microphone. Hold on. Here we go. All right. Thank you for coming here today. As you know, this is a meeting to present chapters 1 through 5 of the joint GSP for the Madera Subbasin. We want to take this opportunity to get you familiar with the material. The plan itself will be posted on the Madera County website sometime today. And you'll have plenty of opportunity to review it and give comments in the next 90 days. Today is a chance to get your first look at some of the chapters and a chance for you to ask questions. We hope to engage in a substantive Q&A session at the end. For those of you who've seen the agenda, we're going to do something a little bit different. There's a lot of information to present today, and there are a lot of you in the room. So what we want to do is we want to go through the information fairly quickly. Basically, there's a 5-part presentation, and we'd like, if possible, I'd like you to hold your substantive questions until the end so that we can engage in a discussion. Also, staff has agreed to stay after the formal meeting closes, which is 4 o'clock, for those of you who want to engage in one-on-one discussion or have more questions. If you have any burning questions or questions of clarification during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand or come up to the mic, and we can address those as we go along. This meeting is being recorded, live streamed, so if you do have a question, you need to come up to the microphone. Okay? Any burning questions now? Oh, I should also say that give you a heads up, the Coordination Committee is not a formal decision-making body. This is not a formal decision-making meeting. So for comments, as I said, you'll have a comment period, and Stephanie and Agneson will talk more about that later in the meeting, and about your opportunities to make comments to the GSAs and written comments as well. Okay? I'd like to bring up our first presenter.
I believe we're doing it from the seats here, so okay, if that's okay.
And I will advance your slides.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be doing the introduction, and then we've broken this presentation up by chapters. So the first slide, I believe, is just the agenda for the meeting. So we're going to go through chapter 1. And again, these are the chapters and how they're laid out in the GSP. So as Malcolm mentioned, later on this afternoon, you're going to be able to go on MaderaCountyWater.com. You're going to be able to access the chapters. They shall be up later this afternoon. And you can kind of follow along about what's going to be in each chapter and contained for these 4 GSAs again, within the GSP. So Chapter 1 will be the introduction and the SGMA requirements. Chapter 2 will be the plan area and basin setting. Chapter 3 will be sustainable management criteria. Chapter 4 is projects and management actions. Chapter 5 is the implementation plan. And then later on in the agenda, we'll have additional questions and discussions of next steps for the Madera Subbasin. We also wanted to remind everybody that the Madera Subbasin, and particularly these 4 GSAs, have received funding from Department of Water Resources. That funding includes a $1.5 million grant to develop this GSP, so none of the funds for the development of this GSP, our staff time, nor the consultants' time have come from the local, well, the staff times come from the local agencies, but none of the consultants' expenses and such have actually come from Madera. They've all been funded through DWR. Additionally, the Madera Subbasin got another grant for monitoring wells. That grant totals about $1 million. And previously, the Madera Subbasin and Madera County area had received a $500,000 grant from DWR. So again, a lot of funds coming to the Madera Subbasin from the state of California. We also wanted to remind everybody that this information has been presented at various public forums over the last year or so. So as you can see up there, there's been a number of technical workshops and groundwater workshops, along with coordination committee meetings related to these topics. So as we go through this presentation, you'll see the chapters and you'll see it throughout the last year, this information has been presented to the public. So with that, moving on to Chapter 1, the introduction. All of the information presented in this introductory chapter, again, was presented at all of these previously held public meetings. So again, there were 7 of these over the last year. All of this information was presented at those meetings. So the introduction chapter, Chapter 1, just goes over the requirements of SGMA. We have to have the plan adopted by January 31st of 2020 for the Madera Subbasin. The entire subbasin must be sustainable by 2040. That includes the other GSAs which are not part of this GSP. There are 3 other GSAs performing their own GSPs, which Greg's going to go over in just a moment. Excuse me. So now through 2040 will be the implementation period for the plan, implementing all the projects. 2040 and beyond will be the sustainability period. So there can be no undesirable results after 2040. Again, more SGMA requirements that are contained in Chapter 1. Sustainable groundwater management is defined as the management and use of groundwater in a manner that can be maintained without causing undesirable results. Those undesirable results are defined by DWR. And I think we're all becoming very familiar with those undesirable results. So the lowering of groundwater levels, reduction in groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, which luckily for the Madera Subbasin is not a problem at the moment, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and interconnected surface water. Malka's going to put those up. And with that, we're going to move on to Chapter 2, which is the plan area and basin setting, which I believe Greg Young is going to take.
Thank you, Dina. Let's go ahead and take the next slide now, Malka. So as we'll kind of touch on the beginning of each one of these chapters, chapter overviews will represent where this material was previously discussed and presented. And so again, with this one, several different meetings, this material has been brought forward. So this is just, again, a reminder, there's been lots of opportunities to hear this material as it's been developed. Next slide. There's in the Madera Subbasin, and we'll look at a map in just a moment, there's 7 GSAs, so groundwater sustainability agencies as defined in the California, both in the water code and in the government code of regulations. Those 7 are Madera County GSA, the Madera Irrigation District GSA, the City of Madera GSA, Madera Water District GSA. Those first 4 are who are represented up here, who have prepared this joint GSP. Then we have Gravelly Ford Water District, Root Creek Water District, and New Stone Water District, and each of those are creating their own individual GSPs. That collectively, there are 4 groundwater sustainability plans that are covering the entirety of the subbasin. And so that's important to recognize because it's required that the entire basin is covered and managed. That's what the state requires. So we have a coordination agreement that we're working on amongst all 7 GSAs to make sure we're all working together to cover this. But again, 4 of us that represent about 95% of the basin's total acreage are preparing this current plan. Next slide. I don't think I can do the mouse, or do we have a pointer at all? I was thinking about this a different way. So what we have here on this map, just try and call out the purple, and I don't know if we tested this for any compliance for visual compliance, ADA compliance issues. So the purple portions are the Madera County GSA, and you see a lot on the eastern edge of the subbasin and kind of in the northwestern edge of the subbasin and a couple of other areas scattered around. The blue is the Madera Irrigation District GSA. In the middle is the City of Madera GSA. A little bit north from the city, you see Madera Water District GSA. The other 3 that are each developing their own individual groundwater sustainability plan, Root Creek, which sits over on the southeast portion of the basin, Gravelly Ford over on the southwest portion, and New Stone kind of in the northwest portion of the basin. So that's just to give everybody a little bit of feel where these things sit and how this particular plan covers the majority of this basin. For the entire subbasin, there's about 350,000 acres. About 200, a little over 200,000 as of 2015 were irrigated. And within, just to give you a perspective, again, the joint GSP covers about 326 of that 350,000 acres. And it irrigates about 197,000 of that 216,000. So again, the 4 GSAs represent the significant portion of the basin and are represented in this plan. Next slide. We're going to talk about the hydrologic conceptual model. And we have a few slides to go over here. This is just a graphic that kind of represents it. This is a model that essentially tries to mimic the operations and the functionality of the basin. And it is a useful tool that we have used in this plan to help understand whether the things we are going to implement, that I know Eric will talk about in Chapter 4, we intend to be able to help us reach sustainability. So this tool, this hydrologic conceptual model, there's a lot that has gone into it, and there's a lot written about it in the materials that are available. Go ahead, next slide. So it includes a variety of things, the superficial soils, subsurface geology, aquifer properties, a bunch of groundwater condition materials. I'm not going to bore us with all the science on this. It's a tremendous amount of work and effort that goes into this. It has been calibrated against existing data, so it is pretty trustworthy where we feel it is representative. So when you can kind of game it with things into the future, you can feel, since it mimics how it's operated historically, that if you game it forward, it's probably pretty trustworthy that it's giving you a reasonable sense of what might be expected. So it is recognized as a tool to help us assess projects and management actions. Next slide. Oh, thank you. This slide is going to go over what we call the consumptive use, which also another way of saying it is the evapotranspiration of applied water, or ETAW. And so this is the portion of water that is generally leaving our basin mostly through crop transpiration, so the annual growing of crops. The overall evapotranspiration is affected both by rainfall, that some of that is helping crops grow and grassland grow, native lands grow, and then there's an applied irrigation water that also helps things grow, especially when there's no rainfall. So the ET of applied water is focused on that applied water portion and that portion that is leaving the basin. So we have a bunch of numbers, and I'm assuming everyone from the back of the room can read these on the table, so it's really easy. See that kind of just, this information is in detail in the document, so please feel free to dig into it. Generally, what this is showing is that we have had a significant shift in certain crop types. There's a green one, right? The items in red here show this change from 1989 cropped areas of about 215,000 to 2015 of around the same, a little bit of increase in acres there in what's considered the irrigated ag portions. A big jump is the what used to be considered idle land is now significantly farmed. The almond orchards has gone up from about 22,000 to 75,000 acres within the subbasin, and pistachio from 14,000 to 27,000 acres, while pasture and alfalfa has dropped significantly. What that really has done is that this number here is about the basin-wide average evapotranspiration or consumptive use that happened back in the late 80s, early 90s at 1.25 acre-feet per acre on average. And today, that number is much higher by almost a half an acre-foot. It's higher because of these crop shifts primarily. Urban use is also important, but it's a minor component when you look at it in the overall perspective of how much water gets consumed in the basin. So there's about, City of Madera consumes, this is again consumption from like urban landscapes, about 4,500 acre-feet a year. Rural residential, it's spread all over the subbasin. It adds up a little bit more just because there's a fair amount of it spread over such a large area. Next slide, please. So the subbasin is provided by both surface water and groundwater. When we look at surface water, it's brought into the subbasin through significant MID contracts and rights. The other GSAs have some water rights and contracts. There's also riparian or appropriative rights that are held, like along the Fresno River and the San Joaquin River. There's also periodic diversions of flood flows that are not, historically have not been part of any right. And there's the portion that routinely seeps and percolates from to the groundwater, both from rainfall and from storm flows that are flowing in all the little channels and everything. Next. And then groundwater, so we have the native groundwater portion that's percolating from rainfall and stormwater and previously seeped percolated surface water. That latter part is when you're importing water through canals and channels and things, some of that is seeping into and contributing to the groundwater basin. So those are our main components of water that we're using to meet all this ET in this basin. Next slide, please. If we were to do nothing, the projection is going forward using kind of today's crop mix with a mimicked historical representation of hydrology, so kind of a various pattern of wet and dry rainfall years and things like that, and contract availability and such, that if we were to do nothing, we're projecting a shortfall between 2040 and 2090 that would average about 165,000 acre-feet a year across this basin. And that's our problem, so that's why we have to take action. That's what Sigma is about, is fix that problem. Next slide. So for meeting the shortfall, we're going to be dealing with several different actions here, and I think you can probably just toggle through all these right now. Since a lot of these slides were used from previous presentations, they were probably set up a little bit more, probably by me, because I like to have animation. Yeah. Recharge projects, incremental reduction from current consumptive use, continued use of stored groundwater which will cause lowering of groundwater during the implementation period, which is 2020 to 2040, and we are using the groundwater model to estimate all the future. So what does all this really mean? That essentially we have to lower this, and this is just a graphic depiction we got to go from a higher amount of use to a lower amount of use, and then we have to sustain that from 2040 on average. Some years we might use more, other years we might use less, depending on rainfall, et cetera, but on average we have to be able to be sustainable beyond 2040, and we have between now and 2040 to try and get there. Next slide. So we're going to talk about another key part of Sigma that Dina had touched on, these sustainable management criteria, the indicators areas. We're going to go through them a little bit about how we're setting up some of what was required to set up minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. These are terms of art that are set forward in the statutory language, and they're discussed in detail in the GSP. So we're going to touch on those really quick. And if we need to come back to those after we get through everything, we can do so. Next slide. Again, these were previously presented. I think the first time was at the May 29th meeting where we started to go through this in detail. Next slide. So 3 aspects. Sorry, I'm catching up on myself here. 3 aspects to sustainability goals. We're going to implement projects and management actions through 2040 to reach sustainability. So we have a 20-year window essentially to try and get there to a point where we feel we can continue to be sustainable from there on out. Groundwater system inflows approximately equal outflows over that 50-year implementation period. That's what the state has asked in these regulations, is you need to design a plan that you can take 20 years to implement, such that once you hit there, you got to be able to stay stable for at least a 50-year period. There also needs to be no undesirable results that would be estimated to occur during that 50-year period. So between 2040 and 2090, again, using that model that we've used to do some assessments, we want to make sure we're not creating undesirable results, and we'll talk about what those mean. The trigger and the concern with undesirable results triggering is you essentially trigger the state to come in and say, you guys aren't handling it locally, we're going to take care of this for you. So the idea of trying to not hit undesirable results really should be translated as we're trying to manage locally and not have the state agencies come in and manage for us. Next slide. So with project condition and a simplified perspective here, we are essentially adding through some recharge projects to where we get a net bump in groundwater, and we're subtracting through demand reduction, and when we're doing some recharge projects, some of those are going to dedicate land that otherwise was productive that's now going to go to just being a recharge basin, so that also has a reduction in consumptive use. So combinations of that, you're going to have about 100,000, a little over 100,000 acre feet reduction plus a 60,000 bump throughout this subbasin. That should be able to get us within our GSAs to a balanced, sustainable condition. That's what we're projecting. Eric will talk more about the projects that are involved there, but that's the general sense. A big chunk of that 100,000 includes down here on this footnote, crop water use reduction program within the Madera County GSA, and that is being targeted at about a 90,000 acre foot reduction level over the next 20 years. So by 2040, we're trying to see that the Madera County GSA, if you remember the map and the picture there, reduces its portion of consumption by about 90,000 acre feet. That's where a lot of this negative has to come. Next slide. So in order for us to be able to monitor what we're doing and be able to report on what we're doing, we're required to also develop a monitoring network. And that monitoring network includes a significant number of wells, which are a subset of the wells used to develop the model. But these are a subset of wells that we have a lot of confidence in. That are called, several of them are called CASGEM wells, which is a state designation. It means it meets a certain threshold. And so we've created this network of all these little dots out here are wells that we're using to monitor, and we have to report every year to the state. By April 1st of every year, we're going to have to report to them about what our conditions are, and every 5 years we need to be able to show how well we're doing against our plan and potentially modify our plan. Next slide. So what is an undesirable result? So for purposes of our groundwater sustainability plan, we are defining the undesirable results for each sustainability indicator, which we'll talk about in a moment here, using the wells that are in that monitoring network, and for the exceedance of groundwater level minimum threshold. What we're trying to define, let me see if I can say this very simplistically. We're trying to say that if for 2 years in a row, the fall groundwater level measurement falls below some minimum threshold that we discuss for the same wells 2 years in a row, for 30% of the wells in that network, we are hitting an undesirable result. That means 1 or 2, so as an example, let's say we have 20 wells that we're monitoring. If 6 of those wells, 6 of the same wells, violate a minimum threshold 2 years in a row, we've triggered an undesirable result. What that also means is we could have 4 of those wells all go below that minimum threshold, and we haven't triggered an undesirable result. So again, it's easy to get kind of confused. I know I wrap myself around the axle on some of these undesirable results a lot, so we're happy to stay around and talk a lot more about this after all this meeting. Next slide. So we're going to talk now about minimum thresholds for groundwater levels. So the primary factors that we considered here are existing beneficial uses, which include drinking water, private wells, small communities, et cetera, the cities, irrigation, and the environment. And we also recognize the human right to water as recently included and recognized in AB 685, and the importance of agriculture to the county economy. So again, we talked about a significant amount of the water used in this basin relates to agricultural irrigation, so that's a significant part of the economics that drive this county. So the GSA recognizes that all these factors are interconnected, and we need time to transition. We need that 20-year period where we can try and move from where we are today to this sustainability, being able to be sustainable. That probably will translate to some lowering of groundwater levels during the implementation. So as we transition, as we reduce demand in some places, we may have water levels that continue to go down. These things are considered when we're setting these minimum thresholds, and we'll show you how here in a moment. We also are considering mitigation for the impacts that might to address the lowering of groundwater levels when it does occur in places that it does occur. And so there's another slide, I think we talk about that also further. So next slide. This one can be a little confusing, so let me see if I can walk everybody through really quick. This, on this green line is basically today. This green line is 20 years from today. So before today, this is what a particular well, and this is just an example of a well condition that was monitoring the groundwater levels. And you see the groundwater levels have been dropping since the 80s to today. Groundwater levels were dropping. The model is the blue line you kind of see here, and the model was mimicking that same sort of drop down in this particular well, and that was the case throughout all the wells. That was part of all the calibration to make the model function. And so it was, the blue is the historic. So the blue is what the well was doing. The brown is what the model represented the well was doing. And so the brown continues on through the implementation and then out into the future and says, this is what we think is going to happen when we implement all these projects during that 20-year period. We expect the water levels at wells, and we have 30 of these, I think, something like that, Pete, somewhere around that number, 30 wells where these things are set, that map that we showed a minute ago. And so this is a prediction of where the future is going to go. What we did then is we said, okay, we're going to pretend that there's a 10-year drought that occurs out here, and we're going to draw this line and extend this drought period, and that creates what we're calling a minimum threshold right here. And we're saying that is, we don't want to ever get there. That's like a floor. But if we get there, and if we get there in 30% of the wells for 2 years in a row, we've triggered the state to come in. So we're trying to set this in a balanced place of groundwater depths, groundwater lowering, where we are also looking at where domestic wells were at each one of these well locations. We had some information on domestic well levels. And some of that information, like in this case, the top of the average domestic well is actually below the minimum threshold. So we were using all that to consider setting this minimum threshold. That's a place we don't want to be, and we're setting it to protect ourselves from keeping the state out, giving us flexibility. This blue line is what's called the measurable objective, and we'll discuss that in a moment. It is where we expect to be and where we really want to be operating. But what you also see is there's a potential for some continued lowering while we implement actions in the projects that we're talking about. So this is what we're discussing about possible lowering of groundwater levels during implementation, but the long-term plan is that we're managing a sustainable level that is well above that minimum threshold. Next slide. So one of the other considerations that we have on that is the fact that we may end up drying up some domestic wells. So there's a consideration about a mitigation program that we'll be developing here in this next year to address dry wells, especially wells associated with rural communities, individual private domestic wells. And we've talked with the county GSA has an advisory committee, and within that advisory committee, an ad hoc group has been assigned to go off and talk about some ideas and bring those back to the next advisory committee meeting in September. And we'll continue to start talking about that and how we might address those kind of things, because we recognize that is an issue. We do want to try and address that. So it may come in the way of low interest loans or grants to try and deal with replacing wells or lowering wells, or maybe some consolidations of programs to try and get community wells put in place. So we're addressing a variety of things with that. Next slide. Let's talk about groundwater storage. So if you recall, Dina went through something fairly quickly that had 6 different criteria. Groundwater level was one, groundwater storage was another. In this case, we essentially are going to use groundwater levels to manage and monitor groundwater storage, because groundwater storage is a component of how deep the aquifer can go, and this aquifer has fresh water, 1,000, 1,500 feet deep potentially in parts of it, and so that's a lot of water, so we're not really worried that much about the groundwater storage volume. We're worried about the level, because the level can translate to an impact to storage and quantity when you calculate it across the entirety of the basin. So we're setting thresholds tied back to the level for purposes of groundwater storage. Next slide. Groundwater quality is obviously an important indicator, and we're setting minimum thresholds that tie to MCL, which is the maximum contaminant level, and it's a value that's established both by EPA, the federal EPA, and the state for drinking water quality. And the primary threshold constituents we're talking about are nitrates, arsenics, and total dissolved solids. And you can see some values up there that we're setting forth. Again, these are minimums, so we're trying to say, look, we don't want conditions to get in this place. These are also tied to what drinking water quality is set to try and meet already. Next slide. Surface water depletion was one of the other indicators. Again, so now we've done groundwater level, groundwater storage, groundwater quality, and now we're talking about surface water depletion. That is one of the other indicators we have to be careful of. And in this case, our subbasin, the way it operates, all of the water levels are really well below the surface water stream. So in other words, there's not a saturated zone where you have a lot of water contributing to a river. There's a lot of places, remember, this sigma applies throughout the whole California, every basin in California. There are several basins in this state, even just to the north, where there are gaining portions of streams that gain from the groundwater levels adjacent to the stream. So it gets water infiltrating and percolating out of the groundwater basin into the stream. This is what this is really trying to address. In our condition, our groundwater levels are well below the stream bottoms, so we are not setting a minimum threshold for surface water depletion because of that condition here in Madera Subbasin. Next slide. One of the considerations associated with surface water depletion is what's called groundwater dependent ecosystems. That's what GDE stands for. And again, in places where the groundwater and surface water are commingling, there are often groundwater dependent ecosystems that if you start to dry things up, you are going to affect them. And there's other areas where the groundwater table is is high enough to possibly support ecosystems. We have identified a few of those areas. Mostly it's to deal with perched water that's kind of sitting on top of a clay layer or something. It's generally in the top 30 feet of the soil profile. So there's a few areas we've identified along the Fresno River, Madera Canal, the San Joaquin River below Friant, and the San Joaquin River along the southern basin. Next slide, please. So land subsidence was the one we did not talk about here. That is one of the other criteria. We didn't have a slide on that. That's why I was coming up with 5 in my mind. I'm like, what's the 6th? Land subsidence has not been a substantial issue or concern at this point, so we have an adaptive management approach presented in the GSP that says it's going to be monitored and watched, but we're not setting any thresholds associated with it because it hasn't occurred yet at this point, and we hope it never occurs. So measurable objectives. Again, I want you to take away from this, minimum thresholds are that thing that we're setting, that we're trying to keep the state away from, outside of our business and let us manage locally. That may be a harsh way to say it, but we're trying to manage locally. We're setting those minimum thresholds to help us with that. Measurable objectives are where we expect to be operating. So this is really the takeaway when we look at some of these graphs, when we look at measurable objective, that's really what we think we're going to be achieving. And that value is the average of the modeled monthly groundwater levels from 2040 to 2090. And so we'll see the graph here again in a minute, and we'll recognize where that line comes in and why that's important. That groundwater level we're also using to monitor groundwater storage. It is the level we're going to deal with for subsidence, that adaptive management aspect for subsidence. We're kind of just using that measurable objective for groundwater levels. The measurable objective for quality are the current constituent concentrations, and we said that we're not setting minimum thresholds nor measurable objectives for surface water depletion or seawater intrusion at this point. Next slide. So as I noted again, measurable objectives is this line here. So this is really what's important to us. We expect that the projects, including the demand reduction, is going to help us get and manage around here. Up and down each year based on various things, but this is where we're targeting. This is a line that's kind of, let's not pass that line, but we're trying to set it in a way that gives us room and flexibility to manage. Next slide. Yay, I'm done. I hand it
Greg.
over to Eric at this point. Thank you for all listening.
Thank you. So Chapter 4 in the GSP covers the projects and management actions and goes into detail for each of the GSAs. And this has been covered previously. The spring presentation especially has a good summary of each GSA's projects and management actions across the basin, what they're hoping to do. Next slide. You've seen this slide already, but the issue is that if we don't do anything with projects and management actions, you're going to have a shortfall projected to be about 166,000 acre feet across the basin. Next slide. Very simply, and Greg already talked about some of these, but the projects in general, the type of projects that are being considered are to use this additional surface water supplies, whether that's better using more flood flows from the various rivers and the bypass systems that are adjacent to the basin or go through the basin, and then purchase water from others, when that could be either somebody who's not going to use their surface water or could be bringing in additional water to the basin. Then conducting recharge projects, whether those are dedicated recharge basins or whether those are on-farm recharge by individual landowners that are, when there's additional surface water flows, they're going to bring those in on-farm. And then some of the projects are where the GSAs are working together on a joint project. So, and then the last thing is demand reduction, which is primarily across the Fresno County, the Madera County GSA. Sorry. And Greg's gonna hit those.
Yeah, I'm going to hit these again real quick. And we'd be happy to have Fresno County do all the demand reduction for us.
Yeah.
Anybody from Fresno County want to volunteer that? Okay. Eric's first to sign up. The important thing, I think, again, and the reason why we were thinking the county should talk about this is the county GSA is going to be taking the majority of the demand reduction actions because they really only have groundwater available. They don't have surface water sources for all the lands that are within the Madera County GSA for the most part. We think there's going to be a suite approach that looks at a variety of actions to achieve the reductions. And those might change over time too. Again, this is during a 20-year period, but we're expecting to try and have an amount each year. And this is discussed in detail in the plan that we're not trying to just push everything off. We're going to start seeing incremental reductions right off the bat, and we're going to be targeting those to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we slide towards a 90,000 acre foot reduction target. So you can imagine it's a fair amount of water each year that has to keep adding on, right? And that's a significant amount of change. So there's a lot to be done here. We're thinking about a variety of approaches, conservation easements, potentially establishing groundwater allocations, maybe creating a market that associates with those allocations, extraction fees. All of that, though, we also recognize will have a temporary continued use of existing stored water, which is why in those graphs we were showing, we are projecting some groundwater levels to continue to decline because as we transition, we're going to be trying to transition on a glide path. And so that's going to result in some continued extraction of currently stored groundwater. And again, as we talked about, possibly establishing mitigation for those dry domestic wells. So it is going to be a multi-pronged approach, and we are continuing to work with the Madera County GSA's advisory committee on that topic.
Next slide.
Next slide.
So putting in place the projects and management actions across the basin, it's estimated that 60,000 of recharge would occur, and 106,000 of roughly of demand reduction.
Moving into Chapter 5. Next slide, please. We have a number of projects, obviously, within the groundwater sustainability plan. A number of those projects have already begun starting back in 2015 and even before that. As you'll see on this, Madera Irrigation District probably has the bulk of the projects that have already occurred, but the projects are moving forward, and they are, I believe, assisting in reduction or assisting the water table. Next slide, please. This shows the remaining years between 2020 and 2040 during the implementation period. This is where you see the bulk of the projects. It's also where you'll see many of the costs accrue over time. What you see here right now is the 7 GSAs. Right now, this particular meeting is regarding 4, but all 7 GSAs within the Madera Subbasin are contributing projects towards sustainability. Next slide. This slide indicates the operations and maintenance and the implementation costs for the various projects. You'll note that it starts relatively low at the beginning as the projects start to unfold and become a reality. As you get towards 2040, those costs become fairly substantial. This does not include capital costs or costs of production or lost production. It's important to note that this is just the implementation and the operations and maintenance. Next slide. There's an annual reporting requirement associated with SGMA. Basically, that's I'll just go ahead and run through the list. The groundwater elevation monitoring from various wells, hydrographs of the groundwater elevations. You've seen a number of hydrographs already today, example well at least. Total groundwater extractions for the prior year, surface water supply, and the changing groundwater. Those factors together point towards where our progress is in implementing the GSP. Next slide. Along with this, there's a data management system that will be going into place. There's a request for a proposal out on that right now. It includes multiple factors associated with the GSP. These are just a few of the factors. If anybody's interested in the acronyms, I could go ahead and provide those after the meeting, but it expands beyond this. The data management system will include everything, all the data collected up until now, and data that's included or collected as we move through the implementation period in 2040. I would anticipate that it would continue after that as well. Next slide. The feedback on the plan. Right now, what I understand is chapters 1 through 3 are available on the website, and I believe that the remaining 4 and 5 will be available by the end of the day. There's also a form on the website that we would like to be filled out. If you have any comments, then submit that to the address shown on there. Additionally, there will be a meeting on October 22nd, 6 to 8 p.m. I believe it's going to be in these chambers. That will be also available for additional information and feedback. And then, of course, all GSAs have meetings. The next meetings that would be applicable, I think, would be the first meetings in September for the various GSAs represented here. Next slide. Let's see it.
Stephanie? Yeah.
So in terms of GSP next steps, we're releasing the draft GSP for public review today. We'll receive public comments on this draft GSP for 90 days, so that'll be through approximately November. We'll revise and respond to comments in November. We're hoping that the GSAs adopt the GSP in December, and then we'll be able to submit to the Department of Water Resources by the end of January in 2020. There'll then be a public comment, an additional public comment period of 60 days on the Department of Water Resources website. They'll evaluate our plan. Our plan's being submitted along with quite a few others, so this will take some time, and then hopefully they will approve the plan. Next slide, please. And just to make you aware, it's not like we're sleeping now that we have the draft plan. We have other activities. So one thing we're doing is we're installing new groundwater monitoring wells. This is what Dina mentioned. This will expand the existing network of representative wells. As Keith mentioned, we have a request for proposals and RFP out right now in August for the data management system, and that will close at the end of August. We're also continually working on the coordination agreement, and Madera Water District has taken the lead with their attorney, Melanie Aldrich, doing the bulk of the work here and coordinating with other legal counsels. And then we will need to get a contract started because we do have an annual report due April 1st, 2020, which is approximately 2 months after we turn in the plan. So that'll be our next project.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay. The floor is now open for questions. A reminder, you do need to speak into the microphone as this meeting is being recorded. The front row here is open if you want to wait in a seat close by. But just please come to the microphone. Feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like and ask your question.
Meeting adjourned.
Just here? Yeah. Just here, fine. I just have a quick clarification question. My name is Natalia Escobedo Garcia. I'm with Leadership Council. So public feedback, you can also give it in all the following board meetings. I didn't quite get a chance to see all the dates. You guys moved through the slides pretty fast.
Tatiana, can you put the slide back with the date? And just to emphasize, the GSAs are the decision-making bodies, so you are always welcome to attend the GSA meetings. Everybody meets monthly on a fixed date. So September 3rd, September 4th, September 10th, or September 11th for the 4 parties in this plan.
There's also the form. Yeah, sorry. Oh, it's on. There's also the form on Madera County where you can leave feedback as well, right?
That's right. Actually, there's a pile of forms out in the lobby if you'd like to leave us a written comment that way, or we have a form you can download on maderacountywwater.com for comments.
And I'd just like to relay a comment from my colleague, Madeline. While it's great that you are creating an ad hoc committee for well mitigation, we do hope that you enforce sufficient demand reduction so it won't have to come to mitigation. Thank you.
Other questions?
Hello, my name is Greg Addington with First and Madera Farm Credit. With some of the potential plans for reducing water, will that be potentially taking crops out of production? Is there a plan for that, for buying acreage, or I know recharge basins were one of the projects which will take some productive land out, but is there going to be projected water restrictions on new crops for permanent plantings or anything of that nature?
Can we bring up the presentation again, and in chapter 4, the demand management slide, please? I appreciate the question. Yeah, there we go. Can we make that full size? There's going to need to be a variety of ways to approach the demand reduction. It is going to result in it's going to need to result in changes of what's actually being grown on the ground in a lot of the Madera County GSA in order to reduce the overall average demand, consumption demand in the basin. how that is done could be through a variety of things. Early on, it may be through some of these conservation easements or purchasing fallowing agreements or rentals of lands or something like that. But by the time we're out at 2040, we're needing to be at a place where we are, on average, consuming less water than we are today. That is going to translate to a different crop mix, and most of that is going to be happening within the Madera County GSA area. Does that answer your question? And Stephanie, I think, has something to add.
But I just wanted to chime in with a plug for the county GSA has an advisory committee, and the next meeting is September 5th at 2 o'clock here in the board chambers, and these are the sorts of discussions that we're thrashing out at that level, but that's a county GSA only. Though we don't check ID at the door or anything like that, it's a public meeting. September 5th at 2 o'clock. And we have an event calendar also at maderacountywater.com that lists all the meetings with as much accuracy as we can muster.
Okay, can you, sorry.
Sorry.
So moving forward, say in 5 years, I want to develop 80 acres of almonds or pistachios. Is there going to be a water allocation? You know, you have to get below 90,000. So
if again, on that slide that's up there, you see the second item as a potentially establishing groundwater allocations, and there's a lot, and as Stephanie had noted, we've been wrangling with some of these ideas and concepts at the advisory committee meetings. So we encourage you to attend that one on the 5th. But as an example, you can look at an allocation that says every acre gets something, or you can say certain acres get more than other acres. And every one of those different concepts have different implications. Or you can just say, we're just going to charge extraction fees such that people make a financial decision that causes the same result. So, I can't, your analogy, there's, a ton of scenarios we could try and run through. We can't predict every one of them, and I think we just need to create flexibility to help us get there in a way that's most manageable for the overall farming economy that is the predominant role in the Madera GSA, Madera County GSA. Does that answer your question?
yeah, so realistically, we can look at, there's going to be some fee associated with it, and it'll become feasible or not feasible to develop the property. And that will be where the reductions will happen.
And again, you're layering in a certain scenario, and so I'm not going to say, yeah, absolutely. I think there's all sorts of considerations. What is to develop a property? Is it already growing something? Is it not? Is it, there's all sorts of implications. When you look at the entirety of the county GSA, we essentially have a bucket of water available to us, and we use a lot more than that bucket today, and we have to stay within that bucket. And so how exactly we do that, we have a lot of ways to try and work that, and it might change over time. What we start out with to get us going might morph into something else to get to the end.
Thank you.
And I just want to clarify that, the demand management slide and what Greg was speaking to relates to the Madera County GSA, which there are 7 different GSAs within the Madera Subbasin. So every GSA is going to manage differently.
Mark Delano, I'm a grower south of town here. I have a unique situation, and I think kind of goes along with the wells that might be like in the white area versus ones where we have availability to surface water. But I have a small farm, and my neighbor and I share a well, and we share a turnout from the district. So my neighbor at this point in time uses no surface water at all, pumps all of his water because it is cost effective for him. Myself, I use the surface water when it's available and just use the well water to supplement the end of the irrigations and stuff. So if you start allocating water, is it allocating per well, per grower? Is the white area get more allocation than the areas that have surface water available? How are those decisions being made and addressed in circumstances like mine where we share the facility?
And so you're in Madera Irrigation District?
Yes.
So MID GSA is not looking at an allocation system
Okay.
for groundwater. We are fairly close to balanced. And so our board made the decision to manage district-wide, which means that we're not looking at any kind of demand management or pumping restrictions. We're going to look at meeting the very small deficit we have for sustainability district-wide, so doing recharge basins, importing more surface water and such for the benefit of the entire MID GSA.
Right, so we're all one then in there. But what about the county and the whole area? I mean, aren't you all trying to get it together to where we're all
Can we
one?
bring up the map of the GSA as one of the early maps? Yes, we all have, from the state's perspective, we have to manage this basin as one, but we also recognize that when you look at this area, and can we make that full size? I don't know who's got the control. Somebody, okay. So if you can see on the map again, the purple area is the Madera County GSA and the blue is the MID. There, I believe there's a mapping tool, and there's probably a link on the Madera County water.com website of you can go find out where your parcel sits within this, right? And understand where you are, because Dina is right, what the Madera Irrigation District GSA is doing to manage is going to be different than what Madera County is because of the circumstances of the water situations that they have, the assets of water assets available. The county GSA only has groundwater assets other than new opportunities that we're going to look to try and bring in water, but those are limited, they're expensive, there's a lot of things, and we're part of the plan is to do recharge in the Madera County GSA, but what happens in Madera Water District is different. What the city is talking about doing is a little different. So there are variances depending on where you are. We do need to manage together, and so that's part of the thing I think that's recognized about all of us working up here together is there is some give and take. We recognize different people have different situations, and we're trying to all make this work together.
Okay, so the county as a whole?
The subbasin as a whole.
Subbasin.
Because remember, the county has Chowchilla subbasin, another subbasin, plus a whole bunch of mountain area.
Okay.
So just the Madera subbasin has to work as a whole to manage to a sustainability goal, and that includes the other GSAs. Yes.
All right.
I hope that answers your question.
Anybody else?
Good afternoon, Al Sheeter from the Mordecai Ranch. I have a question about the cost potential going up to 2040. You said now that the programs you've operating now on a $2.5 million pot of grants, basically to implement and get this thing off the ground. But by 2040, you're saying the costs of the program are going to be up to $14 million a year. What components make up that $14 million a year, and how do you see that being paid?
Seems like I get the default because no one else wants to jump on any of these things. Let Stephanie. Well, it's not Brian's to answer either. Stephanie, you want to?
So I think it's important to note that even though we did group the costs as a whole, each GSA has separate costs. And the costs for the county GSA are the greatest because we have not been building infrastructure and paying for water contracts for 50 or 100 years. So I'll start with that and then shift it to Greg.
And there are so many details. It's hard to give you a real easy answer, but I also don't want to be flip and just say, go read the document. But there is a lot of detail in the document that lays out costs associated with capital O&M, things like that related with each types of projects. Like, so for the county GSA, we have recharge projects that we're trying to pursue in concept, like proxy ideas. We don't know exactly where off of the Chowchilla bypass, and maybe some up using, hopefully we can work out some coordination and conveyance on the Madera Canal and do some projects up in here. we lay those out and say, we think these are going to cost this kind of money to do these kind of things. So there's a lot of detail. The other projects from the other GSAs have a fair amount of detail about capital costs, O&M costs. On top of that, the state requires us to do reporting every year, fairly extensive reporting, and every 5 years you have to essentially assess yourself against your plan. And you have the potential to reevaluate and resubmit a modified plan at that point, so long as you can justify the changes. But all those things, as we all know, they cost time and money, so there's resource elements of that. But the chapters and discussions, and I think it's detailed in chapter 4, is that right, Brian? The authors of the tremendous amount of document, I mean, and there's a lot of paper here, so
Chapter 4 details the projects, details project cost, and expected yield.
yeah, speak into the mic, Brian.
So Chapter 4 details projects and the costs of projects and the expected yields of projects, and even that level of detail is just at a very conceptual, very initial conceptual cost estimate. So these costs will be refined continually as projects are picked and started on a path towards full implementation. So that's in Chapter 4. Chapter 5 talks about GSA implementation costs and annual reporting and 5-year updates that have to happen.
So besides the details that are in there about the cost, I think the other part of your question was, well, how do we pay that? Ideally, we continue to pursue state and federal grants everywhere and anywhere we can. And I think the county, as well as the other GSAs, have all done a great job getting as much as they can. This is a recognized disadvantage. There's a lot of disadvantaged community funds that can be brought to this county and have been pursued and will continue to be pursued. But at the end of the day, there's probably going to need to be fees associated with the extractions, the groundwater or parcel assessments or something in order to fund these things. And these aren't pretty pictures, and I don't know how many of you have been paying attention to some of the other news over the last 6 months or so on this kind of topic throughout the entire San Joaquin Valley, which the state had identified as the critical overdraft basins in the state. So basically from Merced, a little north of Merced, all the way down through Kern are the critical basins. And there's been some assessments done by some think tanks that estimate anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million acres of land equivalent would come out of production to be able to be sustainable. So I mean, that's a big change to this entire San Joaquin Valley, and that's the thing that's facing us. That's the elephant in the room that we're trying to be very forthright with, and how we address that is going to cost money and probably cost money at the owner level. I hope that helps answer your question.
Devin Avilas with Agro Cooperative here in a grower in Madera County. This question is probably for Stephanie and Greg. I know the economic impact study related to this needs to come out. When will that be published for all of us to see?
So there is an economic analysis. It's in the appendices, right? Do you happen to remember which number it is? 7G. No, that's not real.
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but there will be an economic analysis for the Madera Subbasin.
And the appendices will be today and tomorrow?
Friday.
Yeah. So the appendices will be posted Friday.
Tom Willey with C&D Willey Farms, retired. How was it determined that 30 monitoring wells would be adequate to monitor the groundwater status of 350,000 acres? And with that few monitoring wells, doesn't it make the any outcome in each one of those maybe too important? Could you explain how that was determined that 30 wells would do the job?
We're going to defer to Pete Leffler from Ludorf Scalmanini that did the analysis and can answer this question very well.
Okay, so it's a good question. There are actually 37 wells in the current existing network to start with. We are in the process of drilling additional nested monitoring wells, which may total up to about 21 wells. And so there are more coming. This is one of those, of course, many elements of this can evolve over time. Other wells may be added over time. So, you know, as of right now, we've got to work with existing wells, and preferably in the CASGEM network. And so there's a certain limitation on what's available. We have certain criteria we're looking at to select these wells, such as, you know, preferably known depths, construction details, you know, observed recent data, preferably a long history of observed data, and other factors. And, you know, we're looking at spatial distribution, vertical distribution. So, you know, we feel like we've got the best network we can put in place right now. As far as representing, you know, when we have a problem and how we define an undesirable result, that's why we've set it at 30% to, you know, so that if you have a problem at some isolated locations or a few locations, that doesn't drive the net result that you come up with for defining undesirable result. So it's, you know, again, it's something that'll evolve over time, but that's what we've got to start with.
Okay, and these are working irrigation wells, or not just monitoring wells that you look at?
They're a variety, a little bit of a variety, but yeah, a lot of them are, yeah, wells that are operational, working irrigation wells in the CASGEM network.
Can I
And public supply wells also.
I want to add a little bit, though, just to touch on this. The monitoring network, there's a lot of data out there, and the continued, like was discussed in the data management system, collecting groundwater level data for more than just those 30 wells. The regulation says you can pick a subset to create what they're called representative monitoring wells that you can use as an indicator for that area. So that's what, when Pete's talking about those wells that we're looking to add, those are representative monitoring wells. But that doesn't mean we're not also looking at what's truly occurring. It's just there may be more question about how, you know, whether that well is completed accurately or we know the information about it well enough to trust the values. So there is a monitoring network that's a lot broader, but there's a subset that's representative that then ties to these undesirable results. So I hope that, you know, it's not those are the only wells we're going to always look at. Those are the ones that key into this translation up to the state and reporting.
But then other wells could feed official data into the system, like if you saw a poor, something adverse happening in one of those wells, it could trigger looking at other wells around that area and modifying the data that goes into determining, you know, whether you have to reduce irrigation in that area, or are those 30 wells that you're going to do or die with them? Of course, you're saying you may increase the number of them over time. Seems like the more sampling sites that you have, the more chance you have that you're getting a true picture and true average. Just sounds a little scary to be living or dying on 30 wells.
So, you know, I mean, I think 30 wells, actually, it's 37, but, you know, plus, you know, as I said, we're drilling new ones right now that we're adding to it. So, I mean, I think it's going to be fairly representative of the basin as a whole. You know, the DWR provided some guidance on density, which we looked at, and we're well above, you know, the density that they suggest is sort of a minimum density. And so I think, you know, and it's pretty consistent, I think, with other plans. I mean, if you look around, we may even have more wells than some other plans have. So I think it's, I think it's pretty good for, again, we got to start and work with existing wells. And, and a lot of existing wells just don't have good information. And so it's kind of, what we've got to start with. And I think, it's pretty good for a start.
Thank you.
And actually, one other thing I just want to add to that is don't forget that there's 3 other GSPs and they've got wells also that they will have in their plans. So for the subbasin as a whole, there'll actually be, you'd have to add those wells from the other 3 plans.
Good afternoon. Alan Reynolds from Gallo. I had a question regarding there's going to be 4 GSPs. How do those all align in the long run if they're all representing the same basin?
So we have not conducted a comparison between GSPs as of right now. In fact, I don't think those have been released yet. So ours is going out, we're going to read theirs, and then we're going to talk.
But is there a state plan that all of them have to align and become one plan for the basin?
They don't have to become one plan. They do need to be coordinated efforts, though, that agree, generally speaking, in terms of methodology. Does anyone want to augment that? No, they're good.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Steve Elgoriaga, small farmer here in Madera, farm in Fresno County as well. But this is your task here, this groundwater in our basin. But I propose to you that you put pressure on the people putting pressure on you back to the state to find more water. And if they don't want to do it in this state because of all environmental or public perception, or whatever, that they bring it from somewhere else. There's parts of this country that have more water than they can handle. They're flooded or whatever, and they put infrastructure projects across the United States, whether it's airplane systems or highways or railroads. You should put pressure on them to get us more water. If they don't want to do it here in the state, fine, get it from somewhere else. Bring water from the Mississippi or from Washington or from Canada as far as it goes. But put pressure, not just California, but all the states that are deficient of water west of the Rockies, basically. Put pressure on the people trying to screw us and make them help us, and it'll help the whole country in the general. Anyway, that's it.
Any other questions at this time? Okay, I'd like to ask the chair to close the formal meeting.
All right. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Good comments, good questions. The plan will be out on the website by the end of today. Apparently the appendages by Friday. He's nodding his head, yes, Friday. Make comments. Feel free to attend the various GSA board meetings, and the next meeting of the coordination committee will be October 22nd here in the boardroom, I think it is. And I think staff is going to stay around a little bit if you have a one-on-one question. If not, thank you for being here, and we will be adjourned.